Well, the Federal Reserve's latest round of stimulus seems to have hit the Goldilocks spot. Not so small as to be seen as ineffective, not so big as to panic the market. But it's one thing to print money, it's quite another to get consumers to spend it. John Gerzema is co-author of Spend Shift, a look at how the post-crisis values revolution is changing the way we buy, sell and live. He joins me now in the studio. John Gerzema, thanks very much for joining Lateline Business.
Thank you, Philip.
Well, you say in the book that Americans are returning to bedrock American virtues, thrift, faith, creativity, community and hard work. Aren't you just making too much of what we simply call the cautious consumer?
Really, what I expected to see during the course of the crisis was just sort of this endless frugality. But what actually ended up happening was, in surveying 16,000 consumers each quarter and then going out on the road, as I did with my partner, Michael D'Antonio, we actually found people returning to these bedrock sort of common sense values. I think values get very politicized, but we're not talking about values that are either conservative or liberal. They're actually values about hard work, self-reliance, faith, community. And that was the emphasis that was really driving people's spending patterns.
Well, what were some of the things you heard, for example?
Well, it was interesting. I mean, when we traveled the country, there was this strong degree around self-reliance. 56% of American consumers said they wouldn't support a company that took bailout money, for example. So this trend towards self-reliance was also in this emphasis when people were moving away from consuming to sort of actually anti-consuming, shifting from consumption to production. During the crisis, many people actually stepped away from spending money and they started focusing on do-it-yourself skills and other ways to try to find ways to not spend money.
So not buying things from companies that receive bailout money, is that a sense of resentment, do you think?
Absolutely. I think that there's a question about the recovery for whom, at least in America. And when you talk to people on Main Street, as I did, traveling the country, there's this sense of sort of a two societies. And what people were doing is actually realizing that they've got the power of social media, they have the power of their pocketbook to actually be a form of voting, and they're using that in the marketplace. 51% of Australian consumers, 55% of Americans.
But don't you also say you detected a change in 2007 before the global financial crisis hit? So does that suggest this change was taking place before the global financial crisis and it's not a result of the crisis?
See, what I think is interesting is that there were a lot of other factors that were brewing over the last decade. Concerns about the environment, questions around sort of, overall where we were going as a society, at least in America. And so what ended up happening is Americans started saving less or saving more, spending less, and they started to really create these connections to these values. So it didn't happen overnight. I think that the crisis was actually sort of the catalyst that started to move people to this new place.
So does this all fit very nicely as an explanation as to why the stimulus package in the United States isn't proving that effective in developing a sustainable recovery for the United States?
Yeah, I think one of the big questions really is that the consumer is spending cautiously, and they're returning back to focusing on themselves and on their neighborhoods and on their networks. And really the big theme we got out of this, Philip, was it's not about Washington, it's not about big institutions. In fact, trust in institutions in our data and brand asset value has eroded by 50% over the last 5 years. So a lot of the things that we've seen were grassroots sort of solutions that were happening.
But are these attitudes also going to prevent the United States from having a sustainable recovery?
See, I don't think so. I spent time in Detroit. Detroit obviously has been incredibly challenged. The average price of a house is $18,000, and we met amazing entrepreneurs. We met small restaurant owners, small business owners, people that were actually taking advantage of the lack of infrastructure in Detroit to start businesses. So ultimately, the book Spend Shift is a focus on really optimism and the belief that there's this reappraisal that's emerging as people are rediscovering and reinventing their lives.
So do you see anything, you might have noticed the hostility towards the banks that's going on now in Australia. Are these businesses that haven't recognised that shift in consumer values, do you think?
Yeah, I think so. I think that there's a big question about the banking industry being out of touch with what we would say in America is Main Street. 48% of Americans said that they feel like they have more power to have control over institutions today. And that's the function of social media and the ability to have your say. So I think in the banking industry, they need to wake up.
So what are the companies that have actually responded to this change? Because you do have a list of them, but I don't really recognise any of the brands. So, I mean, which companies have actually responded successfully to this change in values?
Sure. So let's talk first about the fact that there's some major companies that are doing this. Ford, for example, we spent time with Ford, their marketer of the year back in the United States. Scott Monty, who's head of social media, created a very innovative program to test launch the Ford Fiesta in a very open manner using Twitter. Microsoft, with its Elevate America program, they're vowing to retrain 2 million Americans with IT training, taking their assets and deploying them to good use. And even Walmart. I mean, Walmart, with its 11 Moms program, it's an active listening program to take mommy bloggers to act as sort of a de facto outside advisory board to Walmart. So many big companies are getting it.
Okay, John Gerzema, we'll have to leave it there. Thanks for joining Lateline Business.
Thank you, Philip.